Okay, and we're good. Hello, and welcome to the Existential Stoic Podcast. This is episode 5. Today we are going to talk about Stoicism and Existentialism, since, it's our namesake, I guess you could say. And it kind of works, because I think we have, a representative existentialist, myself, and a representative Stoic, more or less, Randy, right? Hi, Randy.
Hi, Danny. I was wondering when you were going to introduce us.
I meant to say that. Sorry. So anyway, I'm Danny, it's Randy, and so we're going to look at existentialism and stoicism today. Do you want to start with stoicism? We'll go semi-chronologically.
That sounds great to me.
Okay.
Yeah, so I like stoicism. It's pretty popular nowadays. I think a lot of people have read about it or heard about it from Tim Ferriss or Ryan Holiday. I mean, in theory, it's great.
No, it is.
In practice, it's terrible.
Do you know what's... Actually, I have to say something. It's funny, teaching philosophy for over a decade, I say this to my students all the time, man, you look at these theories and you have to make a distinction between theory and practice, because something in theory a lot of times is great because you're talking about an ideal, right? And you're talking about a perfect logical system, but the reality of life is not like that. And when you're applying it to your life in practice, it's often a lot more difficult, challenging, and but there's the important thing though is what can we take away and what can we learn? And I do think that Stoicism and Existentialism offer a lot of valuable ideas, insights, and tools that you can use to better your life. They most certainly do, but like you said, it is also terrible sometimes in practice.
It's interesting that you mentioned the theory base, because when I was reading up on the definition of Stoicism on Wikipedia, which I'll share with you shortly, it talks about how it's virtue based, and virtue is very much theory. We try and practice these things, but really they're these theoretical goals that we go towards.
Yeah,
I can't achieve a virtue. I can only go towards that direction.
You can go towards it. Mm-hmm. I think though, so I don't know who wrote the Wikipedia thing, and I think part of that is also because so in ancient Greece, and Stoicism definitely has its groundings in ancient Greece, its sort of beginnings, right? Ancient Greece, they were virtue ethicists, right? So they practiced, we think of morality, we think of rights, right? We think of rights and correlative duties. They thought of morality in terms of character, in terms of virtue. And the idea is that, you develop a disposition, you act a certain way, then you acquire the virtue. So, once you have that character trait, you have the virtue. But I think you're right. In a certain sense, that is an ideal. So, in the sense that you're a virtue, when you're thinking in terms of virtue, you're working towards that character, right? You're working towards the development of yourself in that way. Sorry.
It's almost like a fake it till you make it type of thing.
Kind of. Yeah, actually, no, it is. Aristotle literally said, if you want to be just, do just things, right? You just keep practicing it until eventually you acquire the trait.
You play make-believe and then eventually you become.
Yeah, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
It's funny. I actually use this example a lot of times in my class. And this is a silly example, and it's very simple, but imagining opening the door for somebody, right? We take that as a nice gesture in society. You hold the door for someone when they're behind you. And imagine you want to start doing that. If you just force yourself to do it every time somebody's behind you, you make sure that you hold the door, and you will get some positive reinforcement. You might get smiled at. Somebody might say thank you, right? After you do that enough, eventually you will just do it. And that's kind of the idea behind virtue ethics, right? Is that if I just do this enough, eventually I will form that. Because look at human beings, we form habits for everything. Habituation is a big part of how we live our lives, right? Practice, tradition, all that shit is really habits.
We're creatures of habits. Aristotle said a man is his habits. Yeah. So let's get into the definition of Stoicism according to Wikipedia. So Stoicism is a school of Hellenistic philosophy founded by Zeno of Citium in Athens in the early 3rd century BC. It's a before Christ. Holy cow. It's a philosophy of personal ethics informed by its system of logic and its views on the natural world. According to its teachings, as social beings, the path to eudaimonia, which is happiness or blessedness, is found in accepting the moment as it presents itself and not allowing oneself to be controlled by the desire for pleasure or the fear of pain, by using one's mind to understand the world and to do one's part in nature's plan, and by working together and treating others fair. Geez, that's the longest sentence. But wait, there's one more part that's good before we'll start talking about it.
All right.
The Stoics are especially known for teaching that virtue is the only good for human beings, and that external things such as health, wealth, and pleasure are not good or bad in themselves, but have value as material for virtue to act upon.
Can I add something real quick?
Nope.
So, okay, damn it. No, so anyway, when you said, eudaimonia, the Greek word that is often interpreted as happiness, it really, just for clarity, I guess, it really means like, in the sense that like Aristotle and those guys use it, we interpret it as happiness, but our conception of happiness is very different, I think. We tend to think of it as like a mental state, like a joyous state. They really thought of it in terms like eudaimonia means like success, well-being. So like Aristotle thought, for instance, like if you were, and actually the Stoics, I would argue, probably thought this as well, like if you were just successful in life, like if you did really well, you had eudaimonia, right? You didn't necessarily have to have the mental state to go with it all the time. So I think it's an important distinction, just because we usually think of happiness, I think, very differently. We think of it more like a joyous state or whatever, and that's not necessarily what they had in mind.
Yeah,
it's like being successful, well-being, you know, that kind of idea I think works better. But anyway.
I definitely imagine that there are people who are very much, I would say, in the flow state, so concerned and obsessed with what they're doing and enjoying that path that they don't even think about whether they're happy or not.
Well, I think that's important, right? Like if you're in the right, I think that's true too. We tend to overthink happiness maybe, and it kind of ruins it, right?
No kidding.
We've talked about this before, right?
How are you feeling? Well, I was feeling great until you asked me.
Yeah, and then once you asked me, now it sucks. Now I'm thinking about it, and now I question everything. And I think that's true, right? When we're in the moment doing the things, we don't even think about it because we are doing well. We feel well, right? We're doing great, and that's really what matters. Maybe.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I like what they say here, how it's the teaching that virtue is the only good, and that external things such as health, wealth, and pleasure are not good or bad in themselves, but have value as material for virtue to act upon.
Yeah, right? Because it's a basic idea, right? That any externals in the world, anything really, right? And, all the ancient Greeks thought this, and the Stoics thought this, right? That, whatever we have is good or bad in relation to how we are or how we use it, right? So being virtuous, we have the wisdom, we have the know-how, and we have the skill set to use these things in the right way and get the most from them. It's just like, look at money, right? I mean, money can be great or it can be hell, right? Depending on how you use it, depending on what you do with it.
They say money makes you more of what you are. So if you're a good person and you're used to donating 10% of everything you make, money will make you more of a good person because 10% of $1 million is $100,000.
You can do a lot more, yeah.
10,000 is 1,000. Whereas if you're an asshole, money will just make you more of an asshole.
Yeah, right? And think about it too, if you have bad habits, money's going to probably make those habits a lot worse, and make it a lot harder to move away from them and better yourself.
Yeah.
Because money can also be an insulator to really protecting or denying any self-development too, I think, in certain sense.
Yeah. And another thing that I like here, that with Stoicism, it kind of aligns with Buddhism, at least in my point of mind, is that the path to eudaimonia is found in accepting the moment as it presents itself. So it's basically just being present and accepting it.
Yeah, accepting what we can't control, right? Accepting what is. Mm-hmm. And a big part of Stoicism is recognizing that what is in control is the things we have control over, namely ourselves, our thinking, right? And realizing that the things that are out of our control, the external world, chance, fortune, those things, we can't control them, but we can control how we respond to them, right? We control how we react. And that's the important part. So you're right. I think it is kind of like learning how to be in the moment, learning that, it's really up to me how I perceive things, how I think about things. And I think that aspect of Stoicism, I think, is highly valuable, especially right now in these trying, uncertain times. I'm going to keep saying it. Why not? Right? No, but honestly, I think, there's a lot we can learn from that, right? That, focusing more on how we think. And I mean, God, I've done this to myself so many times where I get in a bad mood and I ruin a whole day or I waste hours. I did this freaking yesterday and I was aware of it and I couldn't get my head out of it. I get in this mental space that's shitty and I'm like, dude, what's going on. You study this stuff, why, and eventually I got out of it, but it's hard, right? And I know it's me doing it. That's the worst part.
It reminds me of a scene from the movie Due Date with Robert Downey Jr. and Zach Galifianakis.
Oh, that was a good movie.
Yeah, where Zach Galifianakis is playing the typical character he plays in every other movie.
The awkward, uncomfortable.
Yeah, he's a short, fat guy from The Hangover.
Hangover, yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And so basically, the day starts off really poorly, and Zach Galifianakis, he's like, well, you know what they say, when it starts out like this, it can only go up. And Robert Downey Jr. is the pessimist in this movie, and he's like, what are you talking about? When it starts out like this, it can only get worse. And he's and they have an argument about that, and it's just, the same situation happens to the same people, but it totally 100% depends on how you interpret it.
Well, it's funny too, right? Because it is true. It's 100% true. Our perspective literally determines our interpretation and determines everything, right? I mean, it's like, if you go, this example I think works well. You go, imagine somewhere really fun, like an amusement park, right? You're going to have a great day at the amusement park. But if something terrible happens right beforehand, say a bad breakup or something, right? That's going to color the whole experience, right? You're going to be miserable all day. And it has nothing to do with the amusement park or your joy in going to the amusement park. It has to do with your mental state, right? And like we have so much control over that, but at the same time, it's like we don't. Also, which is interesting, like we have to work to have that control. I think that's the important point, right?
How cool would it be to be able to choose when you're having like good state? Like if you had to have a certain quota of like good mental states and bad mental states, and you could just choose, okay, for the next 4 hours, I'm just going to be in a shitty mood, but then after that, it's going to be totally cool for the next 20 hours. And you got to actually select it, because then maybe
that'd be great, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could be like, I'll just do it, while
at least you
I'm
could plan.
Right?
No, it's funny too, because it is true. Like, man, there's so many times where like I've literally convinced myself to be positive about something and have a way better experience doing it. Specifically, like a lot of times with work and stuff, like I find too, especially like, I love writing. Writing is like one of my favorite hobbies, but at the same time, it's hard a lot of times, and I get writer's block and stuff. And I'll force myself to be positive, and it makes it such a good experience. And I almost like remind myself of why I enjoy it, right? And like, I don't understand why sometimes I can't seem to do that, or I struggle with it. And it's like, man, we have so much control on the one hand. On the other hand, it seems like it's so out of our control sometimes. But it really is in our control. And I think that's one of the greatest points of Stoicism is that, I think, recognizing that, dude, this is our life, right? It's really up to us how we live it. And it's really also on us to live a good life and to be good people and to have good experiences. That's on us, right?
Yeah. I think another part that I like about Stoicism is just the concept of like patience and endurance. Like if I had to choose one word to describe Stoicism, it would be endurance.
Yeah.
Like the ability to endure through whatever is going on.
Good or bad, the ability to sort of persevere through it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, and it's a good point.
Yeah.
Difficult one.
Yeah. So if you're interested in Stoicism, there are some good books on it. There's Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
That's the classic
Letters
one.
to a Stoic by Seneca.
Epictetus is good too.
Yeah, I haven't read any of his, but I hear about
He's
him.
the one that says, oh God, I can't remember the quote right now, damn it. He talks about self-mastery being, like really the highest thing we should achieve, right? Is mastery over ourselves. And it's interesting because I should point out too, Stoicism, the conception of self-mastery they have really does go back to Socrates and Plato. It's this idea that we're rational creatures, right? And that if you think of like the Greeks thought of our soul, or our character, I should say, as having, rational and non-rational parts, right? You have your reason, which is the rational part. The non-rational parts are like your appetites, like hunger, thirst, and your emotions, right? Those are by themselves non-rational, right? But we can make them rational by developing ourselves, working on ourselves in such a way that reason has its natural place at the top, essentially, and the other parts of the soul, they fulfill their function, but they do it and they listen to reason, so that they become rational through reason's involvement, essentially, right? Which makes sense, because it's like, think about like, and Marcus Aurelius and all talks about this, I believe, like bad experiences like grief. Grief can really send somebody really off their life path, right? It can, I mean, it has done it to me, right? We've suffered through a lot of grief with loss of friends and things like that, and, horrible situations, and it can really derail you. And it can really, and it's an emotional state that can really control your life, dictate how you feel, how you interpret everything. You can get really upset, depressed. And the idea is if you have a strong character, if you come into these situations with a strong, rational character, you understand the need to work through your grief, right? To experience it in a healthy way, but not to let it overwhelm you, right? So you sort of process it in the right way. That's the idea. And I think that's a very valuable tool and a very valuable thing to think about.
Yeah, building character and virtues are definitely important. I had this experience this week where, talking about grief, so I work as a veterinarian, and end of life with animals is a daily occurrence there. And so we see all forms of grief.
We've talked about that.
Oh, yeah, we've talked about that. And so there was one day where I had to euthanize 3 animals, and that was tough, but one of the owners was like very, very grief-stricken because I had seen the dog earlier in the week, and we had talked that it was probably not looking good for the dog. I mean, it was a 14-year-old black lab, and that's old. That's 2 lifetimes for a black lab.
Yeah.
But they were very attached, and understandably so. And
hey, it's one of the hardest things to let go of a pet, right? They become part of the family.
Yeah.
I mean, especially the way we treat them in the U.S.
Yeah, and when I had seen it a couple days before, I told them that, things aren't looking good, but let's at least try this. We can at least try this. And so we tried, and it didn't work. The medications didn't work. But as she was in her grief, she was like, how could you give me that much medications? How could you give me 2 weeks of medications? As if, I gave her that hope that it would turn around.
You gave her 2 weeks, and, so she was thinking, I got at least 2 weeks.
Yeah.
He gave me 2 weeks of medication, yeah.
Yeah, and for a little while, I was taken aback because I felt insulted by it. But then I was looking at it, and I was like, I was trying to do the best that I could. And who knows what would have happened, because you never know what's going to happen.
And also, too, and from your perspective, too, and let's be fair, you're right. She was in a grief-stricken state. She wasn't thinking about you, the doctor, the person, right? She was just thinking about the situation.
Mm-hmm.
You gave her 2 weeks of medicine. That kind of makes sense, right? Because if it did work, you don't want to have to come back the day later. Hey, you only gave me 1 day's supply. That's kind of stupid when you think about it. And then when you think of cost of medications and stuff, a lot of times buying a 2 week supply is cheaper anyway. It makes more sense than buying 1 day worth, So, I mean, rationally, practically speaking, it made a lot of sense what you did. But from her perspective, but I think that's also important, right? Understanding the other person, understanding their situation, what they're going through, and then not responding to that in a way that's negative, right?
Yeah, so talking about character and virtues, for a while I had a difficult time kind of understanding what virtues were.
Okay.
And I've come around to it. But just for instance, Ben Franklin has his 13 virtues, and that's something that I've been working through for a while. He has things like temperance and tranquility.
They're very classic virtues, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's really interesting. And cleanliness, all these different things. But virtues definitely dictate what you're going. I think they dictate the quality of experience you're going to have.
Well, I think the idea is, right, that virtue refers to character traits, right, dispositions. So developing the right set of virtues, it does dictate the type of experience you're going to have, because it's preparing you, the person, right, for the experiences, whatever might happen, and preparing you to handle them in the best way, if you want to think of it that way. Mm-hmm. And they're interesting. Virtues, I think, are very interesting. One thing I like about virtue ethics, I will say, is, and the idea of virtue, is because in virtue ethics and in virtue theory, right action flows from right character. You develop the right character trait, you will do the right thing. There are no rights. There's no set of rules outside, external to the person. What I like about that is that, in our conception of ethics and morality, the way we think of it in terms of rights, it's very abstract to the individual and abstracted from the individual. It's outside of you, right? It exists in the world, and I need to conform to it. But virtue ethics is actually about self-development. So it's very much focused on the individual, and I think that's a much better way to think of it, because you're not thinking of a good life or being a good person as something you have to conform to, but something you become. And I think that's a much healthier and actually more positive way of looking at morality and the good life, right? It's something that I do, that I have control over, not some system I conform to, right?
And I would even say that it already exists within you. We look at virtues like honesty or charity or, I don't know, those are the 2 that came to mind, but
you just said others. Temperance, patience, courage. Yeah, whatever. Okay, so we got 2.
Yeah. And I guarantee there are moments you can look back in your life and be like, I was honest at that moment. Even though it was tough, I was honest. Or I was charitable. I gave that person $1, they needed something. And so they all exist within us, but we can manifest them more.
More or less, yeah. You know, it's interesting. You know the concept of the golden mean?
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle's conception of the golden mean. So he said, right, for every virtue, there's two vices. There's the vice of excess and the vice of deficiency. And the mean, to be a virtuous person, you work towards the mean, getting yourself to that mean, whatever it is for you, and it's different for each individual. We have natural tendencies towards excess or deficiency, each of us that are different, right? And the one thing that's cool about that is, like, you know, when you think of virtue in that way, it's like, it is within our power to be virtuous. Aristotle very much thought that we are neither good nor bad at the outset, right? We have the propensity to be good or the propensity to be bad. And it's about aligning our character in the right way. When you think of it that way, it kind of makes sense, because it's not like you're not changing yourself dramatically. You're nudging yourself, right? You're nudging your character this way or that to get to the right point. And once you develop it, you cultivate it, right? You keep it going, you foster, right? You grow, and it gets better over time. That's the idea, I guess.
So, if being good or bad aren't really good or bad in and of themselves, then is it that we try and be good because it makes us feel better, and try to avoid being bad because it makes us feel worse?
I mean, it depends on how you. Okay, yes, but so, like, that's kind of a really, yeah, no. So if we're talking about virtue ethics, a lot of the virtue ethicists, like a lot of people that believe in virtue, do believe that, you know, so since we're rational beings, not to get too much into theory, I guess, but Aristotle and all these thinkers, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, they all really follow this tradition. So this is accurate for all of them, but they think that we are rational. Human beings are rational beings, right? That's what our defining quality. To do things that are in accordance with our nature, so to do things that are in accordance with reason, does feel good. So to be virtuous actually does feel good. We feel pleasure from doing things that are in accordance with who we are, and which makes sense, right? If you think about it, I like that idea as well, because it's like, if you develop in the right way and you act in the right way, it feels good because it's an affirmation of who you are, right? It's an affirmation of your nature. It's an affirmation. It's like almost.
So if you're doing bad stuff, then that's not who you are.
Well, look, so if you're doing bad stuff, you might still get pleasure from it, but it's not that same type of pleasure, right? It's a pleasure that's not connected with your development, your personal development. So these guys all believe that, you know, there's a natural pleasure in developing ourselves. There's a natural pleasure in doing things that are in accordance with our character. Think of like a talent, right? If you have a natural gift at something, a lot of times doing that thing feels good. And it feels good to develop it, right? Because you're already good at it. And it feels natural, right? It feels like who you are. And that's a big part of it. I think the bad things in life, or doing bad, that ultimately we do experience some pleasure in it. It's not the same type of pleasure, though. It's not that natural pleasure to us. It's a pleasure external to us in a certain sense, right? Like
those are addictive.
Well, exactly. Like, think of like getting high, right? People that get addicted to substances.
Never had any experience there.
Yeah, right. Never done that in my life.
Right.
I have personally. Yeah. Like, so no. Like, you think about getting high or something like that, right? You're using an external thing to make yourself feel better rather than naturally feeling good, right? Rather than that natural pleasure you get from just living life and living an active life and doing things that are in accordance with who you are. And I think there's a lot of value in that. I mean, look, one of the important things I think with any of these theories or any of these ideas is, I mean, I always think of it in terms of, like, you know, there's a lot of good stuff to take away from all these theories that can help you in life, that can make your life better. And a lot of times it's just figuring out what works for you. And I think all of these offer something valuable. And a lot of times it's not that you have to adopt the whole theory. You don't have to become you don't have to become a Stoic and 100%, right? But there's going to be things in all of these theories that are valuable. And all of these ideas are ideas that have been developed and have been adopted by many people because they work. And I think that in and of itself is a good sign, right? That there's something there and something worthwhile.
Yeah.
If you look at that maybe that way.
Yeah. So let's take a look at existentialism.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I love existentialism.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest.
Yeah. This was one I remember. Read The Stranger by Albert Camus.
Great book.
Yeah, that kind of started my exploration.
Camus is one of my favorite authors. Yeah, The Myth of Sisyphus, The Stranger, The Plague. I mean, they're all great. You have. I like existentialism because a lot of the thinkers are literary figures. So you have Dostoevsky, Kafka. You have Jean-Paul Sartre, right? You have all these thinkers.
Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard, right? And a lot of them write plays. They write novels. So it's a different way of looking at the theory, right? And getting to the theory, it's a lot of fun. At least from an academic standpoint, I guess.
Yeah. I wish I still had the book of Either Or from Kierkegaard, because I remember there was one passage that was like, if you do this or if you do that, it will you will be you'll be happy or you'll be sad.
Well,
it doesn't matter if you do this, you'll be sad. If you don't do this, you'll be sad. If you do this or do this, you'll be sad. If you don't do this, you'll be sad. And it's just like, it was completely absurd in its saying. It's basically saying, like, no matter what you do or the opposite of what you do, you'll experience both happiness and sadness.
Well, yeah, the either or, the concept of either or for Kierkegaard really refers to the either or in the ethical decision. It's the decision either to be good or bad, right? Once you make that decision, when you're confronted with a situation where you have to decide to be good or bad, it's like, you know, when we think of a good person, we don't think of somebody who arbitrarily does a good action now and again, right? You don't think of somebody who, like, you know, the person who decides, oh my God, if I donate $10,000 this year, I can write it off on my taxes and I won't pay anything in taxes. That's not a good person, right? That's a one-off action and it's done for the wrong reasons. So when you choose to be good, he's saying, you know, that's a choice that's going to then define you henceforth. And it's an either or situation, right? So it's like you either are choosing one or the other. That's the basic idea.
And it's such a difficult path to follow, to choose to be good or bad, because there's so many.
Well, that's the point, right?
So many. There's so many opportunities to be good and bad.
There are.
I would say, as a person, I choose to be good, but there are some things that I do that are marginal or bad, and it's just like, it's so hard to stay good all the time, because sometimes the bad thing feels so good.
It does, and you know, it's hard to navigate. It's also hard to know which is right or wrong, right? It's hard to know sometimes what the good or the bad is in a specific situation. And I mean, come on, honestly, sometimes it's difficult. We don't know these things absolutely. And I think that's where I love existentialism, because existentialism, a lot of it is about meaning making. It's about finding meaning in the world because we create that meaning. And I love that aspect of it, because it really does tie into, you know, living your own life. Living an authentic life is crucial for existentialism. But do you want to read the definition?
Yeah, let's go into it, because you were just touching on it. We're finding meaning in an absurd world.
Yeah, exactly, right?
So existentialism is a form of philosophical inquiry that explores the nature of existence by emphasizing experience of the human subject. Not merely the thinking subject, but the acting, feeling, living human individual. In the view of the existentialist, the individual starting point has been called the existential angst, or variably existential attitude, dread, etc., or a sense of disorientation, confusion, or anxiety in the face of an apparently meaningless or absurd world.
Basically how I feel all the time.
Right? It's like none of it makes sense. It's all completely ridiculous.
I do want to make one point. So it's interesting because existentialism and Stoicism are a very interesting thing that we've paired here. Because the existentialists are actually, part of what they're doing, part of what motivates this whole movement is a reaction against the classical view that puts reason on top. So the Stoicism very much follow that tradition that says human beings are rational and that's the most important thing. Reason's put on a pedestal, right? And the existentialists come along and they say, look, reason's great. It's an excellent thing, but it's not all we are. And so, but what's interesting about this is they take a different approach, so their focus is still on the individual. I think there's a lot of overlap though, right? Values like honesty overlap, character development overlaps with both. I mean, there's a lot of very interesting overlap between these theories that's important.
Danny, I feel like you're reading right from Wikipedia, because this is like the next paragraph where it says...
I'm not.
Many existentialists regarded traditional systematic or academic philosophies in style and content as too abstract and remote from concrete human experience. A primary virtue in existentialist thought is authenticity. Yeah, it's like literally you just said that stuff.
I know, it's almost like I teach it. It's crazy, right?
If only we had an expert.
No, it's funny. You know, it is true though. No, but it's funny because it's true though, right? Authenticity becomes sort of, I think that, so if you look at like the Stoics, you look at the ancient Greeks, right? The good life is tied to virtuous life, right? Which is tied to becoming a rational person. Becoming a, you know, reason is the pinnacle there, right? So you become a rational person, you become a good person, and that's part of living a good life. That's crucial for eudaimonia. Existentialism, you get a slight shift because the emphasis now is on authenticity. It's living your own unique life. And what I love about existentialism is, like, so Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, right? The underground man literally lives underground. Because when he goes above ground, he's in the world, right? He's in the social world, he has to participate in that world, he loses himself as a particular. It's only underground that he can be the unique individual, right? And it's interesting because this idea of authenticity is also about being alone and facing the world alone, which is very different, I think, in that respect from Stoicism, but also very valuable, right? In its own right. I think existentialism is a great philosophy. I don't know. I like it, but
and it's also interesting because they come from two different time periods.
Yeah,
so
radically different.
Stoicism is like the ancient Greeks 3 centuries before Christ, whereas existentialism really came about after World War II, after people saw a lot of the travesties of war and what it does to people.
Yeah, a lot of those thinkers were writing right after World War II. Yeah. The fathers of existentialism are really Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, who are right before that time, right? Pretty much right before World War I. I mean, they're kind of in the 1800s there.
And then how much more of an absurd world can you get?
Well, exactly.
They have.
Think about what they're
concentration camps and
you
mass
see
executions.
Mass war, mass devastation with weapons, right? Weapons that slaughter cities. You're seeing concentration camps. You're seeing industrialization. You're seeing the individual who is now alienated from everything. If you're thinking about Marx here, right? The alienation from labor, the alienation from our lives. You're seeing a concentration on Christ, what do you call it? Where you do like one specific task. Oh my God, what is that?
I don't know.
Oh man. Well, anyway, specialization. Jesus Christ. Right? So you see an emphasis on specialization, right? Where you're no longer developing your whole self. And I think this is interesting because it is a response to all this, right? And the world is kind of, I think about the absurdity of the world all the time. Yeah, you ever think like you're driving down the highway, right? And you look at like, okay, so first of all, we've leveled all this land to make a highway so we can drive these vehicles, right? Instead of opting for other forms of transportation, we get rid of the natural world and we impose upon it this sort of fabricated uniform world of the social that we've created, right? And then you see all this BS, like all these advertisements that are thrown in our face all the time, all this stuff that's thrown in our faces all the time that is absurd. I mean, it is when you think about it. When you really think about it, it's like, why should I value that? They're trying to make us form values for all these things. And it's treated, I mean, look at right now. We talk about fake news. We talk about, like all these liars and corruption and politics and stuff. It's very absurd in a big way. And then how do you find meaning in that world, right? When all meaning kind of has been lost.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've lost connection with the world that we were designed to be in. Over the past 100 or 200 years, we've gone from living in nature, pretty much, to very much living outside of it. There are some people who never see nature.
And you're right. And depending on, and even if we weren't living directly in nature, we were depending on nature in a much different way. We were connected to nature in a much different way, right? Because we were growing our food. We were making our food from scratch. We were building houses, in a place, picking a place and making the wood, right? We don't do any of that anymore. Like, think about meat. You go to the grocery store, when you think of meat, you think of a packaged product. You don't think of an animal, right? You don't think of killing the animal. I mean, you do that stuff. But I'm just saying, we have this abstraction from all these things that used to be a part of our lives. And this is one of the things I think that's an important point because existentialism is really a response to that, right? That loss of the whole individual in a way through these processes of socialization and building the cultural kind of community that has sort of, I think in a big way, kind of removed the individual from him or herself, right? In a weird way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And this also, existentialism also reminds me of Buddhism, because in this, you're emphasizing the experience of the individual. So not only the thoughts, but also the feelings, the acting, all of that stuff. Which, when you meditate, when you do that stuff, it's focusing on what's happening right now. What thoughts, what feelings, what drives, what sensations.
I'm glad you brought that up, actually. There is a lot of overlap between Buddhism, even Hinduism, existentialism, even it's funny, I think that's one of the things I always find funny is, we look at all these different theories and ways of being in the world, living in the world, and people see them as distinct. They're really not. I mean, there is overlap, and it's like you look at the world of religions, right? There's overlap in all of them and how you're supposed to live your life, and because I think the same ideas come up again and again because they are the best we have.
I've always thought that when there's multiple answers for something or multiple solutions, it's because we don't know.
Yeah, right. Well, right. That's the other thing, right? It's Socrates said, "The only thing I know is that I know nothing." And in a certain sense, I think that is also an important point, right? To also recognize what we don't know. Is it big? Because, when we believe we know things, I think that's an important idea about authenticity too, is developing your own perspective, your own interpretation of the world is a very plastic notion. That should change over time as you change. It's recognizing that meaning isn't fixed. When you believe you know and you've fixed meaning, right, you've also cut off development.
Yeah, then you're going to get smacked upside the head by the world.
The world's going to bitch slap you, literally, right? Yeah, that's a bad way to be, I think.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting because even though there are some overlaps, existentialism and Stoicism are kind of opposites as well.
In a big way, yeah, they're very different too.
Because one is like, pay attention to what's going on right now and the feelings and the thoughts and all the sensations, and the other one's just like, endure through it.
Endure through it, right? Kind of almost ignore it, persevere through it. I think, should we touch on some like main themes in existentialism?
Absolutely.
Let's do that, yeah. So I think one of the, most people are familiar with Sartre's concept that existence precedes essence, that idea, right? That human beings aren't defined until after they exist, and they define themselves. So whereas in Stoicism, human beings are defined prior to their existence as rational beings, right? And then they live in the world, as they become rational, they realize themselves. You could think of it like that. So in existentialism, existence precedes essence is this idea that there is no meaning, there is no overarching purpose. We define ourselves as we live our lives, right? Sartre thought, and I think you see this common in a lot of existentialists, that comes with what he called radical freedom and radical responsibility, right? So there's this freedom to be whoever we are. We have that potential. We can live our lives however we want, but it also means we are absolutely responsible for everything we do. Now, this makes sense when you think of this in terms of when Sartre was writing right after World War II, right? Because Sartre saw these people participating in the war, claiming like, I was just following orders, and he thought, no, you're 100% accountable and responsible. You could have killed yourself, literally, right? You could have killed yourself, you could have ran away. You could have done many things to not do those actions that were horrendous and horrible on other people. So he thinks in that strict sense, we are accountable for everything. And I mean, this is hard for people to bear, I think, and to deal with, right? Like we deny things a lot. Look at climate change. We deny our accountability. We blame big corporations. We blame the world. But in a certain respect, each individual is also responsible, right? And you're responsible for your own. And I guess let me say, the one thing I really like about it though is this, it emphasizes that idea that you're responsible for your life. And I think that is important, right? Owning your own life, living your own life. It's like Camus said in The Myth of Sisyphus too, right? That like, once there's this realization of absurdity and you realize that there is no God's plan or overall purpose, fate becomes a human matter. It becomes something that human beings now control, that man now controls, right? Because now it's up to you to live your life to determine your fate, essentially, or accept your fate, I guess you could say, and own it. Does that make sense?
It definitely makes sense, because we see that all over the place. In the Bible, they talk about you'll reap what you sow. Same type of thing, responsibility. Even in modern books like Extreme Ownership, he talks about same thing, how you just need to be completely responsible for everything that you do. And that's actually, a lot of people think of responsibility as a burden, but actually that's the ultimate freedom, is being 100% responsible, because then it enables you to deal with what you've done up until the moment. And then from that moment, you get to choose where to go forward. I
think you're right too, right? It is that connection to freedom is so important, right? Because once you realize you own your life, you are accountable for it, it's in your hands. You're the author of it, right? It's your narrative that you're writing. It's no one else's. And what's interesting that existentialism is also reacting against is the social world that we live in is constantly trying to force us through various means to be a certain way, right?
To impose its will upon us.
Yeah, exactly.
For their profit.
Exactly, right? Socialization, social conditioning, social pressures, expectations, all of these things weigh on us. Think of even the concept of, oh my God, why can't I think of her name? Sartre's, the woman that wrote with Sartre. Simone
de Beauvoir.
Thank you. Yes. So she wrote Second Sex, and she talks about the concepts of masculinity and femininity, right? If you think of those conceptions, how they're imposed in society, how we, especially how we used to, I would say more so than now, but how we used to teach girls to be feminine, men to be masculine, right? We were kind of training people to sort of form their person in a way conform to this idea, right? And we were indoctrinating them literally into a system to think a certain way about themselves and to be a certain way. And once you realize that you have full control over it, you have absolute freedom, you can start to say no to these things. You can start to reject them. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche has what he calls the three metamorphoses. And it starts off with a camel. You're the camel, you carry the burdens of society on your back, right? So all the obligations, all the pressures, all the expectations, the camel is basically burdened by the weight of the social world, right? He says you have to become a dragon to say no. The dragon represents power, right? So the dragon is the ability to say no to those obligations, no to all this crap, and to once again take ownership of your life. And he says what's interesting is the final metamorphosis is into a child. The child's the last stage because the child represents owning your life and creating your life in your own way, starting anew essentially, right? Like a blank slate of creation. And the child's sort of perspective is clean. The child's perspective, like the baby, right, is not influenced by the social world. It's not influenced by conceptions, by going to school and, you know, learning to walk on the right-hand side versus the left, and all these little things that they teach you, right, that indoctrinate you into a certain way of being. The child is sort of a rejection. It's beyond all of that. It's a new start to be your own life, right, to live your own life and become who you are. Nietzsche famously said that, right? We need to become who we are. We need to be our own selves, be authentic.
It's so interesting in all these different philosophies, the child's mind, the beginner's mind is like the highest goal.
Buddhism is exactly it, right? The child, being a child or being childlike, because, you know, it actually makes sense, right? Nietzsche says this a lot, the Buddhists say this a lot. We need to laugh at our follies. We need to learn to laugh at ourselves, right? To accept that we're going to make mistakes, to accept that we're going to just be ourselves, right? And the child is in a way like the perfect representation of that because they're not sort of tainted by all the BS from the social world, all these expectations, all these things that get us down, the depression, the anxiety. The child's free of that, right? And I think that's why it is the highest state, because it represents living in the world in a way that is purely your own. And I think that is crucial. That is such a beautiful way to think about living, really. I mean, you know, to live in such a way that I can just create myself. And the child also represents potential, right? It represents literally like, it's like a clean slate to create upon, or like a blank canvas, right? Or the unmolded block, if you want to go to Taoism. I mean, it's literally in every one of these theories. You know, it's interesting, and I love that idea because I think it really is cool. You know, this idea that we can get to a point where we own our lives completely and we realize that we are absolutely free to live however we want. And that the only thing holding us back is our own fear of those expectations of the social world, right? And it's also, I mean, I guess I should also say, it's also the fear too of being on our own. Existentialism recognizes that to live an authentic life is to be alone, in the sense that if you create the meaning, if you make your life meaningful, you can't, like, if you adopt society's values, if you conform to society, I can look at my neighbor and I can see they're doing the same thing and I can validate my life on that, right? In an authentic life, the only way to validate your life is to live it your own way and justify yourself through your own meaning making, through your own self-creation. But that means you're completely alone.
Yeah,
right?
And to confront your own mortality.
Exactly. Oh yeah, that's a good point too, right?
Knowing that you have a limited time to do it, that whatever you don't do during it will be left undone.
You know, it's funny, like Sartre, Camus, they all thought, you know, like the only truth we know is that we will die, right? Which sounds terrifying. Like, we all know we're going to die. And what's interesting though is that, like, you know, in a certain sense, we have a limited time here. We're going to die. And on the one hand, you can take that very negatively, right? All this is meaningless. Whatever I do will be lost. I can't bring anything with me. But it's also kind of freeing though, because the other end of that, the other side of that perspective is affirm life and live your own life then, because this is your one shot, right? Own it, live your own life, and don't worry about any of the BS, because frankly, none of it will be there when you die.
Yeah.
So, you know, the best option you have in life is to take full advantage of it and live your own. And we are all going to get taken off our path, right? And distracted. We're all going to find ourselves struggling. But all of those things are opportunities to realize ourselves, to get back on path. That's one way to interpret, I think, more optimistically, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me very much of meditating. This analogy of like getting thrown off your path and then coming back to it. And it happens over and over again in life, where I'll be living kind of in accordance with my life, and then I'll get off track for a while, and then I'll come back and I'll get off track for a while. And it's the same thing that happens when meditating, where I'm focusing on the breath and then I get lost in thought, and then I realize it and come back to focusing on the breath and then get lost in thought.
It's a good analogy, actually, for life, right? You're like getting bumped off that path, trying to get back to it. And it's like almost like we're always trying to get back to it. But I think that's important, right? Because it's a process. We're actively living our lives. So it's never just going to be a perfect straight line, right? It's going to be a squiggly line. There's going to sometimes be long sort of deviations away from where you need to be. But that's okay too. I think that's one of the important things to realize is, like, for the existentialist, right, living an authentic life, if that's the ideal, it doesn't matter when you do it, as long as you do it, right? So it doesn't matter if, like, you know, I worry about that all the time, right? I'm 38. I worry all the time that, did I waste time? Did I waste some time in my life when I could have been doing other things that were more productive or whatever? And you know what? It's gone. That has already happened. And I think Stoicism would give it a similar response, right? You can't dwell on that because it's already happened. What you can do, though, is work on now. You can endure through it, you can work on it, you can try to be authentic, you can live your life, and that will make it valuable regardless. And I think that's an important idea, right? Because like everything we face in life is a chance to overcome ourselves, to realize what we're capable of. All those fears that we challenge, that we confront, right, and overcome, we develop ourselves. We learn something about who we are, and that's crucial.
Yeah, and I think nowadays there's such a push towards existential crises, because if we look back a long time ago, all the people that were looked up to were older. They were wise. They had lived. You know, they were 40 plus years old, 40 to death.
They were 26.
Like yeah, I know, right? They were on their deathbed at 29.
They were 26. They had 10 kids now.
But nowadays, all the people that are looked up to are these tech whiz kids that make billions of dollars when they're 13 years old. These superstars and movie stars.
And they don't even know themselves.
Teens. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't even know who they are.
Yeah.
But you know what? I think that's a great point, because why do we look up to them? Because they're wealthy. We don't look up to them because they're good people, because they know who they are. And I'm not saying that all of them are, bad or anything. But you know what I mean? We're looking up to them for really the wrong reason. And I think that's probably a great point, right, to take away, which is, why are we looking up to these people? And
I think it's because it's a natural thing to figure out where we fit in with society. I was actually listening to this thing the other day, talking about fish. And fish very easily know where they fit in with society.
I didn't know where you were going to go with that.
Yeah, right? Fish. It turns out they're very slippery. But no, they know where they fit in with society. Because the bigger you are, that's it. It's size
it makes sense, right? Yeah.
So if there's a big fish and a small fish, the small fish gets out of the way.
Because it could get eaten, it could get killed, right? Something could happen. Okay.
Yeah, it's the same thing that we do with boats to decide who gets out of the way with boats. The one with the most gross tonnage keeps going and the smaller one moves out of the way. But with people, there's not really that clear of a defined thing, because you can't tell about the person just by looking at them. The sheer size doesn't mean anything.
Size doesn't mean anything, and also there's no easy solution or algorithm for figuring out what matters, right?
Well, there isn't, but the easiest thing to measure is money.
Yeah, it is. In society like ours, it is the easiest thing to measure, unfortunately, right?
Yeah.
But that also gives us a skewed sense of what a good life is. It gives us a skewed sense of value, because dollars don't equal personal value. They don't. Now, don't get me wrong, money is important. It absolutely is. But like we said before, right, that study showed after a certain point of income, it does not affect your happiness anymore. It no longer contributes to making your life better. Money will obviously if you're struggling to survive, money will make your life obviously make you happier, because your essential needs are met. You can live a more comfortable life. But at a certain point, it doesn't matter. And I think that's our biggest problem. We struggle with these things. We look at like beauty, right? We look at money, and really, we're not looking at a whole person. And I think
how absurd would it be if we looked at other things, like the taller you are, the more important you are, or the bigger your feet, or the darker your skin color.
Yeah.
I mean, what if we associated these things with money, because they're all just arbitrary choices.
It's all arbitrary distinctions, right?
Yeah.
And if we really, I think that's an important takeaway from both Stoicism and Existentialism, right? If living the rational life, developing character, that's important, right? Let's talk about some of the values they both endorse. Honesty is one of the most principal values that both of these theories endorse. Honesty with oneself.
Yeah, be true to yourself.
Yeah. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, right? Being honest with yourself is probably the thing we're worst at, human beings. We lie to ourselves all the time. And if we're honest with ourselves, we can start facing those fears, facing the things in the world that we're struggling with, and really live a life that is our own.
And I think that money caused this dishonesty.
Yeah.
Because, you look back at...
It's a good chance.
You look back at all of these Western movies, the cowboys and everything. They'd be like, you call me a liar? them be fighting words.
Yeah, right.
And then they'd have a duel at high noon.
And one of them's dead, and they move on.
Yeah, exactly. Like, back then, honesty was such an important thing. But then came around, if I'm dishonest, I can get money, and then I can do whatever I want with the money.
Well, it's like, look at our court system, right? If you have enough money, you're basically above the law.
Yeah.
So it's like, if in the end of the day, I think personal honesty is all we really have to hold on to, right? If we can be honest with ourselves, we can confront the world in a way that other people cannot. Which you can confront the world authentically and as your own, essentially, right? You can make it what you want. And that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah. there's a lot to learn from both these views, I think. It's a great way to think, either of these. And I think what's nice too, and I think this is true of all philosophy, right? There's things you can take away from each that can help you live. You don't have to adopt the whole theory. You don't have to think this way. You don't have to read every book. But, look at some of the core ideas. I think they're really valuable, and they can help you really address things in your life and live the best life you can.
Yeah.
It is interesting, too, that all these views, like you said, the idea of the baby, right? And also the idea of just personal development. Being a better person is crucial, however you define that.
Yep. So,
all right.
I think that's good. Existentialism and Stoicism all in one episode.
Yeah, pretty good, right?
There you go. You're all experts now.
Yeah, move on. You're good.
Well, keep watching. Keep listening.
Well, yeah, keep listening, obviously. Yeah. We'll talk about other things, too.
Yeah. Right on. So next week we'll be back with another episode. Make sure can you subscribe to podcasts?
I think so. Yeah, you can subscribe.
Yeah, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Can you like them?
I think so.
Make sure you like it as well.
Do these things if you can.
And
if you can figure it out.
And join us next week, same time. We'll discuss something else.
All right, thanks a lot. Later, Randy.
Later, Danny.